allegiance to the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Carry, coast. Ready, talk. Right, face. Forward, march. Left, 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 right, right, left, 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 right, right hand left, 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 right, right hand left.
Oh, yeah.
I've done this a few times. Just keep it maybe about a forefinger from your mouth.
Mhm.
Okay, great. Speak up loud. You know.
Boom. Yep. Good evening, and thank you all for joining us this evening. I want to especially give a warm welcome to our Beverly High School class of 1963 alumni here with us this evening. I'm Anna Green, Vice President of the Beverly Education Foundation. We're celebrating 26 years of a unique partnership with the Beverly Public Schools and you, bringing schools and citizens together to improve public education, to help children strive for excellence, and to expand their knowledge. Tonight, we've seen a great example of the Beverly Public Schools with our color guard. These were all volunteer children, students, along with Major Andrew Walters. And I just would like to call their names out this evening. Cadet First Sergeant Bancroft, Cadet Sergeant Mora, Cadet PFC Sanin, and Cadet Private Wright. We all know that good schools are an essential for the well-being of students and to the civic health of our communities. As an independent nonprofit organization, the Beverly Education Foundation actively fundraises in order to award grants for projects that impact a significant number of students while tied to system-wide goals that support education, curriculum, augment professional development, and raise the profile of public education. One of our campaigns, Honor a Teacher, in the spring, is just a wonderful way to show the excellence of our educators. In addition, we secure corporate donors, and we have just secured 10 years of funding from the Cummings Foundation to bolster teacher support, professional development, better connections between teachers, parents, and students, and to provide additional innovative programs to prepare Beverly students for their futures. We were an early supporter of the one-to-one at this new high school 12 years ago. This is a program that is a lease to own, and you pay in for 4 years, and the student walks away with a computer. Many children were unable to participate in those leases, and the foundation helped by subsidizing leases for them, thereby contributing to the quality of education in Beverly and equal opportunity of all students. That is how we got to know our speaker tonight, David S. Ferriero. Tonight we're going to be led and moderated by a very neat young man, Jay Foss, Doug Walker, Sarah ALO, Lorinda Visnick, and I met Jay almost 2 years ago. He interviewed us on his show, Raising Your Inner Voice, at the North Shore 104.9. And he's graciously agreed to lead this discussion tonight. Jay, in addition to doing this, currently runs his own DJ business, does concert lighting at the Shannon Liu Performance Center in Rockport, and is the audio-visual manager at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in Hamilton, where he lives with his wife, 2 sons, a dog, and 9 chickens. And if you'd like the breakdown on the chickens, I have them. Thank you so much for Jay. I'll turn it over now to our foundation president, Douglas Walker.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Doug Walker. I'm the president of the Beverly Education Foundation. I would like to thank the Beverly High School and the administration team for all their help and allowing us to use this great facility. I would also like to thank the board of the Beverly Education Foundation for all their Herculean efforts to make this night happen. And thank you all for coming here tonight. Tonight's proceedings are also being live streamed on BevCam's YouTube page. There are many really cool things about Beverly, and one of the best can be seen right outside this building. Beverly has the only continuously operating solar array set up by the Carter administration in 1977. So Beverly was forward-thinking when we installed them, and as we look back, we recognize the importance of those panels and have just finished expanding them. What a great idea. Thus, Beverly benefited from the past and the works of the future. Just like the National Archives, we can look at the documents of the past to learn and work for the future. Both the solar panels outside the school and the National Archives benefit everybody. Similarly, Beverly makes investments in our children. The Beverly schools have one of the most effective one-to-one language laptop programs in the state. And in 1959, Beverly made an educational investment in the incoming freshman class, resulting in the high-quality class of 1963. Our return on our investment on all of these projects has been immense. Our speaker tonight is just one of the beneficiaries of Beverly's commitment to education, and by his benefiting from the Beverly education, and by this, we have all benefited from his expertise. It is my distinct pleasure to be here to introduce tonight's distinguished speaker. To be honest, I have been looking forward to this since the night in 2014 when Mr. Ferriero spoke here. I know that it will be both informative and thought-provoking. David Ferriero is a graduate of the class of 1963 from Beverly High School, and not this building, but an older one, I assume. not this one? And since then has done great things with his Beverly education. David served as the director of the New York Public Library and as the university librarian and the vice provost for library affairs at Duke University. He recently retired as the 10th Archivist of the United States. He was also the first librarian to hold that position, which is amazing to me that it took all that time. Mr. Ferriero will no doubt have an inside take on books, access to books, and the importance of the printed word, as well as historical documents and have for all of us. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you David S. Ferriero.
So, David.
So, Jay.
Let's get started with what exactly is an archivist?
Well, I'm not technically an archivist. I'm a librarian. And there's a great deal of controversy there was a great deal of controversy when my nomination was announced among the professional community.
Why so?
He's only a librarian, as one of the commentators said. He's only a librarian. it's a different pattern of education, and it's a false dichotomy. Librarians and archivists are responsible for collecting, protecting, and encouraging the use of fill in the blank, whether it's primary materials or records or educational materials or whatever it is, but the basic functions are the same. The processes are a little bit different in terms of how archives are created and dependent upon robust records management programs, so that so that the entity ends up with something to actually archive.
Okay.
A good example of that is when I became the librarian at Duke University, the Duke archives reported directly to the president. And she came to me, this is Nan Cohan, who was the president at the time. She came to me and she said, this doesn't make any sense. The archives should report to you. The archivist at that point was a Duke grad historian, not trained as an archivist. So it was kind of a political situation. So I said to her, the only way you're going to, this is going to work is if you hire a consultant. So she did that. She hired a consultant who delivered a report that said it should report to the librarian. So she came to me and she said, now will you take it? And I said, not until you let me create a records management program, because Duke didn't have a records management program.
Really?
So you can't have a decent archives without professional care around the creation and maintenance of the records to begin with. So that's what the subtle twist between an archivist's responsibility and a librarian's responsibility.
Okay. And tell us how you became the 10th archivist of the United States.
It's just hard to believe. I was, in retrospect now, I had this cushy job at the New York Public Library. I had an office on Fifth Avenue. I had a lion outside my window. A Friday afternoon in April, a call. My assistant came into the office and said the White House is on the phone. And I picked up the phone and I said yes. And this 12-year-old who was working on appointments for the president, he was an undergraduate at Georgetown, said, we're looking at you. No, he said, first of all, he said, aren't you surprised to be getting a call from the White House? This snotty kid. We got beyond that, and he said, I'm calling because we're looking at you for the position of Archivist of the United States. And this was something that was never on my radar screen. Never occurred to me that this was something that I would even consider. And it's a presidential appointment. So I was highly suspicious. For me, presidential appointments are usually someone who's given a lot of money to a campaign, or a friend of the president, and mainly doesn't have the credentials, doesn't know the business. So why are they looking at someone who knows the business? So this poor kid said, well, would you think about it over the weekend? And he called back on Monday morning, and we had the same conversation. I said, Kyle Watkins, the kid's name is. And I said, I'm really flattered, but you're really looking at the wrong person. So 10 minutes later, an adult called and asked if he could come to New York and talk to me about the job. So Tom Wheeler, who was the head of the FCC, came to New York and talked to me about what the Obama administration was looking for in the new archivist. And it all had to do with the Obama Open Government Initiative to create a more transparent and collaborative government. And they were convinced that the archives had an important role to play in that process. And that was the trigger for me. That's what attracted me to the job, that combined with the fact that it was the Obama administration and an opportunity to give back, doing public service at the government level was what really convinced me.
Why was that so interesting for you?
I knew the business. I knew, I knew how to run an archives. I was responsible for archives at MIT, Duke, and the New York Public Library. So the technicalities of the job were were interesting, but it was the opportunity to think at policy levels about how records can be used to be more open and transparent, to let the American public have access to the records of the country in new and innovative ways.
So right now, if people are interested in actually accessing any of the records, what's the procedure like?
Go to archives.gov and search the catalog.
It's that simple.
Yeah. It's getting better. A strategic plan that scared my staff significantly. I made the statement that we were going to digitize everything. Everything.
Everything.
Everything, yeah. And that everything translates into about 14 billion pieces of paper and miles and miles of film and video and maps and all kinds of things. But I'm firmly convinced that it's the only way that we're going to provide, especially kids, with access to our records, is to make sure that they're digitized and available 24 hours a day online. And coupled with the fact that I was able to convince the president to issue a directive around managing government records electronically. So we have shifted the federal government off of paper into electronic record keeping. So that stake in the ground around digitizing everything is everything that is sitting in files and 42 facilities of the National Archives across the country. So that's the process that's underway now.
Wow. You've met and worked with several presidents.
Seven.
Several.
Seven.
Seven.
Mm-hmm.
7 presidents.
7 presidents, 8 first ladies.
Any favorites?
We don't talk about favorites. Every one of them, well, almost every one of them, has something I can say something positive about. One of my first tasks as archivist was to take on the creation of the Bush 43 Library in Dallas. And that was, I had an impression of that president in my head, and I was not looking forward to my first meeting with him. But he is the most charming individual outside of his office. One of the nicest guys. And we had a wonderful conversation about electronic records because he'd never created any. He never used email. Wow. And I was citing the facts about how many electronic records there are from his administration. And he came across the desk and he said, and you know, not one of those is mine. And the day before I left Washington for my retirement, he called to wish me good luck and suggested that I take up painting.
Painting?
Because he's painting. He's now painting. He's got,
right.
He's doing exhibits.
That's
He's
right.
got books published. Yes.
There's been much written about overclassification, too much secret or restricted information. Who actually gets to decide that? 2,500
original classifiers in the executive branch. There are 25 individuals who have the authority to classify. That's down from, when I started, 9,500. So there are fewer of them at work, but we're still up against the fact that there are no standards for classification, that what is top secret in one agency may be not secret at all in another agency, so there are no standards. And the process is, it's much easier to just classify something than it is to go line by line and make a determination about whether it really needs to be classified. So it's a huge problem. There's too much classification. Overclassification is a huge problem. And there is the reason I know so much about this is that within the National Archives is a unit called the Information Security Oversight Office, which monitors classification across the executive branch. And that unit has an advisory board that provides a report to the president every year. And for the 12 years I was there, the report always recommended dealing with this lack of standardization to reduce the number of classified documents.
Just to let everyone know, I wanted to take a quick break and let you know that we are going to open up the floor for questions in a little bit, but I have a couple more prepared questions. What are the proper ways of declassifying documents?
Interesting topic.
Yeah, I bet you never saw it coming.
The president has a magic wand, and he can just say, this is declassified.
That makes sense.
The president does have the authority to declassify, but there is a process to follow. Most classified content, most classified records come from the intelligence community, and there are multiple agencies that have equities in most of those classified records. So it's the CIA and one of the branches of service, military service, and perhaps the FBI, all have equities in a single document. So you can't just say it's declassified without notifying those agencies that it's been declassified, because it's not the only copy of that classified record. So it's very important that in the declassification process, the originating agencies are notified. And so far, that has not happened.
That has not happened. Okay.
Yes.
Can you tell me about what important roles libraries and museums play in sustaining our democracy?
Sure. I think I've got two letters to. First of all, the National Archives didn't become the National Archives until the Franklin Roosevelt administration. So records were stored in attics and basements all over town and subject to fire, theft, and all kinds of horrible problems. The British burned the town during the War of 1812. The charters were stored at the State Department, and a clever clerk named Stephen Pleasanton, who is my personal hero, recognized that those charters were at risk, and he rolled them up, stuffed them into linen sacks, commandeered a wagon on the street, and took them into the hills of Virginia. And it's the only reason that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the Bill of Rights exist today.
Wow.
In our rotunda. So they have been at risk. The records have been at risk from the very beginning, dragged from Philadelphia, New York, Washington. So it's amazing what I had a responsibility for actually existed. So it's not until the Roosevelt administration, but as early as Thomas Jefferson, there were concerns about the records. And I'm going to just read a couple of letters from Jefferson that explain. This is Jefferson in 1789, who said, wherever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government, that whenever things get so far wrong as to attract their notice, they may be relied on to set them to rights. So from the very beginning, the thrust was to make the records available, to make sure that the American people had access to the records so that they could correct problems that they saw coming. So that was 1789, and then in 1791, another letter from Jefferson where he says, time and accident are committing daily havoc on the originals deposited in our public offices. The late war has done the work of centuries in this business. The lost cannot be recovered, but let us save what remains, not by vaults and locks which fence them from the public eye and use in consigning them to the waste of time, but by such a multiplication of copies as shall place them beyond the reach of accident. Multiplication of copies. He is the grandfather of my digitization project. This multiplication of projects. And then FDR, who I'm convinced was a closet archivist himself, when he was dedicating his presidential library in Hyde Park in 1941, said he likened the dedication of a library to an act of faith, to bring together the records of the past and to house them in buildings where they will be preserved for the use of men and women in the future, A nation must believe in three things. It must believe in the past, it must believe in the future, it must, above all, believe in the capacity of its own people so to learn from the past that they can gain in judgment in creating their own future. So from the very beginning, the thrust has been make those records available so that the American people can hold their government accountable and learn from the past. And that's what drove me for my entire time at the National Archives, making it easy for people to do that.
Wow. I'm just taking that in for a moment. That's amazing. Can you tell me about your time in Beverly Public School System? How has the education that you gained led to you to where you are now?
I had a great experience. I loved school from Mrs. Robinson's first grade class, where I was in the Bluebird reading section. Can you believe that? They could never get away with that now. I think there were starlings, and the lowest group, you were classified as a bird based on your reading ability. So, but I was a good student, and I loved my time in elementary school. Grace Dowling in the third grade, whose aunt Minnie Greenleaf lived around the corner, so there were all these personal collections, and she had a coat room full of rubber stamps that she stamped when you did a good job on your papers. And I got to fill the inkwells for our penmanship class with our traveling Miss Adams was the traveling penmanship teacher. She was about 300 years old when we, and in fact, it was so bad that she was my father's penmanship teacher, and she's the one who broke my father of using his left hand. But by the time I got there, I'm also left-handed. And she had gotten over that. So we had a circuit penmanship teacher, a circuit art teacher, Mrs. Fish, who taught me about Rosa Bonheur and her love of horses. I was a good student and loved and thought I was going to be a teacher. That's where
Really?
I was headed. Yeah.
Okay.
And my favorite class was senior English with Emery Hollerer, who I thought was ancient, but it turns out that that's like his first job out of college. He was only a couple of years older than we were, but he made that class so much fun that it wasn't a chore, And he's instilled in me a habit of reading 50 pages a night. I have to read 50 pages, and that comes from the training that Emery Hollerer. So I try to always do that, but it's I can't say enough good about the education I got in Beverly Public Schools.
What do you think is the single most important thing that you learned?
Single most important thing. It's the importance of education, and that it's the road to success, and it's just how important it is in a personal life.
Mm-hmm. Jumping back to the archives, can you tell me about the kinds of records that were in your custody?
Sure. Everything from every possible format you can think of: parchment, paper, vellum, film, discs. Conservation and preservation is a huge part of the work of the National Archives. We have trained scientists, chemists, physicists who are daily testing materials for deterioration. As you might expect, the charters are of the highest concern to ensure that those are cared for, especially so that the temperature environmental conditions are appropriate for for the Declaration of Independence, for instance. So just about every format you can think of. And when you get into the business of electronic records, we've identified over 500, about 575 file formats for digital records, which is an amazing challenge to ensure that those records can be migrated over time and content of them read. This is an international effort to ensure that electronic records are surviving. Huge challenge.
Wow. Before we open up questions to everyone here, a couple were submitted. From a classmate, Brenda Harding, have you ever been nervous about meeting someone or doing an event with them?
God bless Brenda Harding. Where is she? Where are you? Oh, hello. Brenda is an old friend. And I saw that question in advance, and it made me think of, I've had the opportunity to meet lots of folks. And there are two situations where I was just stunned, in awe, and starstruck, I guess. One was when I was at the New York Public Library meeting with Lauren Bacall. We were after her for her papers for the Library of the Performing Arts. And I went to her apartment in the Dakota to talk to her. And I was just like, oh my God, Lauren Bacall. What am I doing here with Lauren Bacall? She was perfectly charming, and I was just tongue-tied. And I can remember as I was leaving, gorgeous apartment. As I was leaving, there was this huge chest by the door, and she said, "And that's Bogey." So she had his stuff too. She did not give her stuff to the New York Public Library. She had kids, and they sold the papers, I think, somewhere. So the second one was I was invited to a dinner at the Supreme Court for a retiring justice, this district court, DC District Court judge, and I was seated next to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And that was my first encounter with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she had on these wonderful white lace gloves, and she was totally charming, and it was the same thing, like, oh my God, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But that was the first of 3 meetings with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The next
Really?
2 were in my office. She came to we did 2 naturalization ceremonies a year, one on Constitution Day and one on Bill of Rights Day, and she was the guest speaker at one of those. And then she came to do a private tour of our 19th Amendment exhibit. And it was a completely different situation in both of those. It was much more relaxed and comfortable, and totally charming individual, and sharp as a tack. She went through that exhibit, and she could talk cogently about every record that was in that exhibit, and she was just wonderful. And in fact, one of the administrative duties of the archivist is managing the administrative process for amending the Constitution. And as you might remember, the ERA is still up in the air about passage, and I was under great pressure to pass it, to ratify it. The timetable has shifted, expired twice. It has been rescinded by 6 states, and the advice from council was don't touch it right now. And I had conversations with Ruth Bader Ginsburg twice, who was surprised that I was getting such blowback about this. And she said, we need to start over. She said that to me twice. We need to start over. So,
Wow. Thank you for sharing. Can you offer any clarity to the ongoing Beverly Marblehead controversy surrounding the birthplace of the U.S. Navy? This is from Richard Pescatore, a Beverly
Richard, are you
birthplace
here?
fan.
Richard, are you here?
There he is.
Thank you for the question. So there are actually 5 places who claim to be the birthplace of the American Navy. When I left here to join the Navy, the sign at the Beverly-Salem Bridge was, "Welcome to Beverly, the birthplace of the American Navy." And when I came back from the Navy, Marblehead had scooped up the title. So I have no idea how that happened or why that happened, but I wasn't happy to see that. So the 5 places who claim to be here it is. Okay. Philadelphia. George Washington signed the law that created the Navy, the Continental Navy, in October of 1775, so they claim to be the birthplace. Whitehall, New York. Benedict Arnold led a naval action on Lake Champlain. Whitehall claims to be the birthplace of the Navy. Machias, Maine. In June of 1775, a British Navy schooner was seized off of Machias, Maine, so they claim to be the birthplace. Providence, Rhode Island claims to be the birthplace because the first call for the establishment of a Navy was made in Providence, Rhode Island. And then, of course, there's, so it's 6 places. Then it's the Beverly and Marblehead fight over who's got it. So it's all about the ship Hannah, which was outfitted. George Washington ordered the outfitting of Hannah, which was in Beverly Harbor. The crew was the Marblehead Regiment, but if you look at the composition of the Marblehead Regiment, there were many Beverly residents who were part of that regiment, so it was a mixed crew. It sailed out of Beverly Harbor. Didn't sail out of Marblehead Harbor. So when I was the archivist, when I met with the directors of the presidential libraries for the first time, they went around the room and introduced themselves, and the director of the Kennedy handed me a copy of a letter that a kid wrote to President Kennedy asking for information about the proposed Peace Corps. It's a letter from me. Then 2 weeks later, the Eisenhower called to tell me they'd found 2 letters from me to President Eisenhower. And then when I was at the LBJ, they handed me a copy of the letter I wrote to LBJ congratulating him for signing the Civil Rights Act. So my staff was so sick of hearing about these letters that one day, the staffer came running in with a letter from Taft to me, claiming that, verifying my claim that Beverly was the birthplace of the American Navy.
That's great.
So as far as I'm concerned, it's still up in the air. And you can have whatever plaques made that say it's the birthplace of the American Navy, and that's what they have over there in Marblehead.
Plaques.
We got a couple of Marblehead ringers in the audience, so.
Doug Walker wants to know, what impacts do you think AI will have on the National Archives?
It's something that I'm really interested in and curious about, because when I was at MIT, in the libraries at MIT, where artificial intelligence was almost born, it was really at a conference in Dartmouth, but the artificial intelligence lab adopted the library as kind of a test bed. So there was a lot of interesting machine learning activities that the AI lab was doing. So I've always been interested in the machine learning aspect of things. There's some very creative work done at the Virginia Tech University, VTU, in that area of face recognition, lots of Civil War photos, for instance, of soldiers who have been identified through loading lots of recognized photos with names and that kind of stuff. We had an active partnership with VTU around testing several machine learning aspects of ways of increasing the processing of records by loading as much of the content as we have made available, and then loading new records in and seeing what kind of matches come up to see if we can describe records in a more efficient way. But I'm really concerned about the misuse of some of these records and how we protect to ensure that those aren't being altered.
Right.
And which is, you know, a huge concern in some of the AI applications that are being bandied about today.
Also from Doug, a burning question. Donald Trump famously...
We don't burn. We don't burn. We rip up, we flush down the toilet, but we don't burn.
That's the question. Donald Trump famously flushed documents and clogged the White House plumbing. What heroic actions are the archivists taking to piece these items back together?
So I don't know if you noticed, but if you Google Trump White House toilets, you will find several references that he made during speeches. All of a sudden, in a rant, he started ranting about the quality of the toilets in the White House. And it's because he was unable to flush those records. That's what stopped up the toilets.
Oh my goodness.
And I never got, I had a cunning idea to get my hands on the plumbing records of the White House to see if I could correlate but we never got around that. So there were issues around tearing up, and some of the records that we did get delivered to us at the change of the administration were baggies of torn up records. And then there was, talking about burning, someone on my staff reported that they saw smoke coming out of the chimney at the White House, and they're convinced that there was actually burning of records, but there's no documentation there. So the records in the White House, and the records in every executive branch agency are controlled by, monitored by a records management unit within the agency who reports up through their own agency. We have, at the National Archives, we have authority over the executive branch agencies in terms of the Federal Records Act, so we have the ability to investigate and guide and provide correction if things are going wrong. But on the presidential records side, we have the opportunity to provide guidance, but we don't have authority to tell them what to do. The only areas where we have authority are suspected removal or destruction of records. And so that's where we were able to make some inroads. So there is within the White House Office of Records Management, the WORM, which is responsible for the records of the White House. And it's a unit that, as I said, doesn't report to me, but reports up to through the secretary at the White House. And we have a very close working relationship with that group. And they were beat up, basically, for 4 years of that administration in terms of trying to get the processes, followed and all that kind of stuff. So I really felt badly for them and invited them, before I left, to come for a tour of the National Archives, and gave them each a copy of, there's a wonderful novel that was written by a friend of mine called Rachel to the Rescue. Eleanor Lippman has written a novel about Rachel as a young intern who's hired to tape together torn up records in the White House. So I gave each member of the WORM a copy of that book. And I gave the director of the WORM, Phil, a plunger with his name on it.
Oh, so appropriate.
Yeah.
The insurrection what would have happened if it were successful? What agencies or departments would have stepped in? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it was, so another administrative role of the National Archives is to administer the whole Electoral College process. So the archivist establishes the date of the Electoral College meetings, sends a letter to the Secretaries of State outlining what the rules are. The Secretaries of State have to deliver to the archivist a certificate of assertion, which is the list of official electors. That's the first document that needs to be sent to the archivist, and it has to be certified with seals and all kinds of stuff. And then when the electors meet on that day, the result of those meetings are forwarded to the archivist as well. And then my staff compares the votes with the original set of electors to make sure that there's no funny business going on. So in this particular case, there was funny business going on because there were 7 bogus lists of electors that were submitted by 7 different states. So at that point, Department of Justice gets involved, and and we make sure that only the official electors' votes are counted. So that whole process and what happens on the Hill when that's certified is meaningful to us and to me. And I was in my office that day watching on television as for that ceremony take place, but also watching this angry mob coming up Pennsylvania Avenue by my window, under my window, screaming, stop the steal, and brandishing all kinds of flags and banners and sticks, and it was scary as hell. It was the scariest moment of my career in Washington, because it occurred to me, if these morons realize what's in this building, what's to stop them from, attacking, this building and trying to damage the charter? So I backed away from the window. I was alone in the building with security people. It was just me and the security folks. The building was sealed, so that didn't happen. But that was my concern. So you should know the question is really about if the mob had destroyed the certificates and they couldn't do the work that they needed to do. Mm-hmm. That was only one set. There are multiple sets of those certificates and the votes, and the National Archives saves one of those sets. Oh. So there's backup. Okay. So that was not at risk, even though there was a lot of stuff in the press about how we came so close to losing everything.
Right.
But we have backup.
Okay.
And it's actually backup online also, because as those certificates are received, they're scanned and put onto our website.
So I think this might be a good moment to open up. If anyone has a question for David, we would love to hear your question. Here, I'll come down with the microphone.
I actually was just hoping you could get back to the question that you asked, and then I think there kind of went in another direction about the importance of libraries and museums in our current state or whatever.
Thank you.
What's the question?
Explain the importance of libraries and museums in our society.
I thought I covered that in terms of access to the records. Everything that I have been doing in my career is figuring out ways to improve access to information, whether it's a college student or doing research, or for the American public in terms of access to our records, so that they can hold the government accountable. That's the basis of our democracy.
We have another one over here.
Hi, I worked with you at MIT in the early 90s. The difference between, you were saying that because those electoral votes were digitized immediately, we had copies, but you also talked earlier about the risk of alteration of digital copies. What's the balance? How should we maintain original versus hard copy versus digital?
There is no, we're now in a situation where there is no paper copy. It's digital only for all of the 275 agencies of the executive branch. So it's the potential of altering a digital record that's used to keep me up at night, not anymore. It's someone else's worry now. The importance of backup. We're heavy users of the federal cloud to ensure that there's a secure place where those records can be kept. But it's you know, cybersecurity is a huge issue.
Is it a greater risk than paper?
Definitely, definitely, yeah. But we're not going back. Yeah. We've had situations where, you know, paper was changed. A noted historian changed a Lincoln paper document to change the date on it to make it look like it was the last thing that he signed before he was assassinated.
I'm wondering if you had top secret clearance and if there was any documents that you examined that were revealed surprises that maybe the general public doesn't know in the United States.
Yes, but I can't talk about it.
Hi. Cemeteries throughout the country are full of deteriorating archival records called tombstones. Is there any hope for restoring and preserving those records?
Are you talking about a specific collection site?
Well, everywhere. Like Central Cemetery in Beverly, the tombstones are deteriorating. You can't read many of them.
Yeah,
I'd love to see them somehow restored.
When I was a Simmons student, I did some volunteer work with Mimi Batchelor. Some of you might remember Mimi Batchelor. Looking at the records in the basement of the City Hall. And I saw firsthand what you're talking about in terms of deterioration. It's, preservation is not an easy sell for funders. It's not the first thing people worry about. And it's, you know, the federal government has several different grant-making opportunities for people to get started, but in terms of long-term maintenance, it's the responsibility of the entity to ensure that that material is available long-term.
Hi. When I graduated from college, my first job was working for LTV Aerospace, which was the prime contractor to NASA over at Kendall Square.
Oh, yeah.
The Electronic
Sure.
Research Center.
Yeah.
And we worked on the project. At the time, we called it the Electronic Library, where we had facilities all over the country. St. Louis had everything and anything you want to know about safety. In California, the Palo Alto was the jet propulsion. Now, one of the things Harvard University allegedly was trying to digitize their entire collection. Was there any collaboration between your department and Harvard on this massive task of trying to digitize?
What year are we talking about? When was this?
On the, I think
The Harvard stuff.
I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe 10 years ago.
No, not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, well, they have this massive program where I think the main library is Weiner or Wiener?
Widener.
Weiner.
Yeah.
And that was the first place that they wanted to digitize. And then they were going to, from what they say, it was an ambitious program.
Yeah. That's interesting. I don't know anything about that, but I would like to know more about it. We were when I was at the New York Public, we were part of the Google Book project, and we did massive amounts of digitization of out of copyright material from the New York Public Library in a consortium of about a dozen different libraries around the country who were creating content for Google Books.
Hi. Beverly has a beautiful public library.
It does.
Yes, on Essex Street and in the farms, even a bookmobile. So I wondered, when you were growing up in Beverly, did you use those libraries?
I did. In fact, I used a little-known branch of the Beverly Public Library in North Beverly, in the Conti Flower Shop. The Contis dedicated one shelving section for books that were delivered from the main library, and the bottom shelf was kids' books, and I can still remember, it was within walking distance from where I grew up, and I can still remember sitting on the floor of Conti's florist shop, surrounded by tubs of flowers and stuff, picking books to read. That was my beginning in libraries. And Mrs. Conti, up until about 5 or 6 years ago, was still alive, living in Florida. And she read an article about me in the Salem News when I was appointed, and sent me a letter because I had talked about the Conti's Flower Shop. It was so nice. And then when I was, could actually go to the main library, I fell in love with Will Barnett in these paintings in the library, in the main library.
They're still there,
Yep.
the Will Barnetts.
And one of my best friends is Chris Loring, who's one of the famous Loring family who have supported the Beverly Public Library forever. And he's a librarian, was the librarian at Smith College.
Hi, honor to have you here tonight. My question, I have a 19-year-old son, and my biggest, I guess, concern today is, and we've touched on a little bit, misinformation.
Yeah.
And I think of the role of an archivist to be that of preserving history. For what reason? To bring a better future. And it's disturbing to see how he is influenced. They say that the newspaper is kind of the rough draft of history, and I guess you could apply that to all of the gigabytes of data that transpire every day, right? As that turns into an archive, how do we use that as a tool? And you mentioned digitization as being kind of the your passion and making it accessible. How do we make it accessible to the younger generation that isn't inclined to read the newspaper, that has journalistic integrity, where sources have been
So that's part of, in answer to your question about the role of the libraries in democracy, one of the values that I developed in my Beverly Public Schools education was critical thinking. The ability to recognize where the content came from, how trusted is it, can I believe who wrote this, what are the credentials, all of that kind of stuff, in going out of my way to read stuff that I wouldn't ordinarily read. So I get a picture, a whole picture of around the issue. And the Pew Foundation does a series of studies about American life and measures American trust of various institutions, and consistently public libraries appear at the top of the list of the most trusted entities in communities. And that they must be doing something right in terms of providing well-rounded collections as well as services that address this critical thinking issue, I think. And it's not easy, I can tell you. This is a gross generalization, but librarians are pretty liberal individuals. And I can still remember when I was at Duke University, and it was the rise of the conservative presses in the publishing business, and my bibliographers resisting collecting conservative literature. And there's a bias that needs to be recognized and conquered in order to present the whole smear for students to make those critical choices.
Yeah, David, of all of the documents, artifacts, of all of the wonderful things that you've witnessed and had been in the presence of, which ones were the ones that really just impressed you? And here it is. Here's this document, or here's this artifact.
It varied.
I'm sure.
We did a lot of VIP tours in the vault, the high-end kinds of stuff, and we always went out of our way to tailor it to the individual. So, and I tried to go into as many of these as possible. And I think, to answer your question, I think the most disturbing and valuable collection are the 375 treaties with Native Americans that were signed, where we promised so much land, hospitals, schools, and never delivered on any of them. We have a private donor who gave us the money to digitize all those records, so all those treaties are now online on our website, and we're regularly visited by tribal elders and tribal lawyers who are still using those treaties to convince the federal government to deliver on some of the promises that were made. So that's one of the areas that I would point to. But as I said, we tailored our vault visits to the individuals, and we had the new commandant of the Coast Guard with us for a visit, and I remembered this situation growing up in Beverly about this legend about the capsizing of a boat off of Mingo Beach, and General Patton, young Major Patton, in a boat with his wife, saving these kids. And I asked my staff, "Can you find?" And they found the records, and we were able to share those with the letter written by Mrs. Patton. I don't think they were married at the time. I think that they were dating, but she was on the boat, and she wrote this 4 or 5 page letter describing the event, saving these kids. These kids were in a boat that capsized. They were passed by several other boats. They weren't saved until the Pattons pulled them on board and described how low in the water they were sailing to get them back to shore. That was a very special moment for me, because I remembered that story and didn't know that there was actually documentation to prove it.
You mentioned access, and you also mentioned nationalarchives.gov.
Yep.
Have you noticed an increase in hits to the website over the last couple of years? Is it decreasing? Is it staying the same? Are people using the media to find out information?
Yeah, it's a steady increase, but I'm more interested in my approach to things is it's fine to point to archives.gov as a place to find information, but it's more important for us to understand where people are going now to find information and get our stuff linked there. So Wikipedia is a primary example. All of our collections are linked to entries in Wikipedia, and we've got something like 3 billion hits a year on our content in Wikipedia, for instance. Flickr for photos. So wherever people are going to find information themselves, we try and link. The Wikipedia thing is still controversial. Some people think it's not a trusted source. I disagree completely. It is the people's encyclopedia, and the editing process weeds out incorrect information. I learned this when I was at the New York Public Library. I encourage my bibliographers, when they're processing a collection, to make a link in Wikipedia in that page so that people get driven into the New York Public Library through Wikipedia. A staff member in the Library for the Performing Arts had just finished processing the Patty Chayefsky collection and went in to make the link, and she discovered all these errors in the page. And she had editorial chops and went in and made the corrections. And within half an hour, she had a flaming email from a faculty member at Northwestern University who had created the page. How dare you? And she flamed right back, saying, I've got the records, I have the documentation. So it's a self-policing kind of thing.
This is a multi-part question. So knowing that you were the former archivist of the United States made me wonder about archivists in other countries, and if you had any connection or correspondence with them and how they might do things differently.
Yeah.
And the second part of the question is that while there is a lot of history in this country, it is still a relatively new country, and how archival differences in archival techniques between older and younger countries, if you were aware of such a difference or distinction.
There is a really good group called the International Council of Archivists, and it's the national archivists from around the world who get together every 2 years to compare notes. We have, at the National Archives, had the closest working relationships with the archives of the UK, Australia, and Canada. Similar issues in terms of electronic records. Great variety, as you might expect in third world countries, in terms of just getting support for paper record keeping and records management in general. So it's a really mixed bag, and it follows just the economic situation in each of the countries. But we have, as I said before, this business with the file formats for electronic records. Most of the work that's being done to address that is through this consortium of the English-speaking archives.
Thanks. So you talked a lot about libraries and books and all that. I recently read an article that 85% of Gen Z get their information, and this was specifically to the financial world, financial information from financial influencers, which to me is a very frightening thought process, right? So how are we addressing that? If the students today, and I don't have one, but are using social media and not really using books, going to libraries like I grew up doing, how do we preserve some of the stuff that you've worked so hard to keep and to preserve and archive? Any thoughts? It's kind of loaded.
Education, education, education. There's a wonderful book called The Filter Bubble. I forget, Ari something or other, which spells out exactly what this issue is, where people are getting their information from one source and not exposed to other sources. Recognizing that in educational programs and schools, and teaching people that they need to, how to do basic research is multiple sources of information and comparing multiple sources of information. it's a huge problem.
So David, tell me, how do you feel about the future going forward? Are you hopeful? Leave us on a good note here.
Of course I'm hopeful. Of course I'm hopeful. We are at a very serious time in our history. I think we have lots of forces working for us and against us. It's very important in these times for people to not sit back and wring their hands, but to get involved, to act. There's a wonderful book called The Bill of Obligations by Richard Haas, H-A-A-S-S. That's a take on the Bill of Rights and translates each one of those rights into an obligation. One of the most moving events at the National Archives are those naturalization ceremonies that we do, where 100 new citizens are sworn in front of the charters. And in each one of those ceremonies, there's an outside speaker who has gone through the process. Ruth Gator Binsberg, and Jose Andres, and Elaine Chow, and a long list of Madeleine Albright, people who have gone through the process, and talked about not only the rights that people have, but the obligations. And I think that gets lost. We're so focused on our rights and not on our obligations that we need to pay attention to that, get involved, call out things that are wrong, that you see that are wrong, and get involved.
This is so fascinating. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. And thank you all for coming this evening. We have a lot of gratitude, many thanks. And first of all of the Dr. Trochuk, Superintendent of Public Schools, thank you, as well as the leadership of Beverly High School, Principal Mark Thomas, Phil Cordair, Paul Casey, Curriculum Director for the Humanities, Judy Miller, where is she? Not here now, Barb Fecto, as well as all of the students who helped participate today. BevCam, tremendous. Thank you so much for your help. And Chris Harvey and the text that makes sure that we were up and running tonight. As we leave, and as David and Jay have kind of shown us tonight, we have to support our public institutions, support those things that really make our community what it is and makes our country what it is. And one of the things that we have to support is education. So I ask you to support the Beverly Education Foundation. Remember, our great nation is built upon an informed citizenry. And that's to help us determine those issues and what we're going to do with those issues and how we face them. So advocate for education, support it, fund it, and get involved in it. And again, thank you so much for all of the questions, all of the support, and for your time and wisdom, both of you.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Can I just need to do one shout out to someone who couldn't be here tonight, who's watching in the live stream, the oldest living Ferriero, who's 95 years old, my Uncle Feeney, who would be sitting right over there with his wife and daughter, is watching online. And he literally is the oldest living Ferriero because we're the only ones who pronounce it incorrectly. So Feeney, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.